What is the most up way you got back at someone that wronged you? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. One summer afternoon, my friend and I were fishing at a local creek when his older brother showed up. True to form, he started being a jerk, throwing rocks into the water to scare the fish away, and then, for no reason at all, he threw my friend's bike into the creek. We were both 13 at the time, and seeing my friend start to cry made me feel terrible. Without thinking twice, I jumped into the creek, pulled his bike out, and promised my friend that we'd get his brother back. About a month later, we were fishing again, in the heat of summer. I told my friend, today's the day we get him back. After catching a 2-3 pound carp, we tossed it up onto the bank and left it there while we finished fishing. Later that night, when we were heading back to his place, we saw his brother's car parked on the street. We took the carp, sliced it open, and shoved it under the driver's seat. Then, we rolled the windows about 3/4 of the way up. The next morning, I completely forgot about what we'd done. But when I rode past his brother's car, I noticed that the window looked a little off. As I got closer, I realized it was completely covered in flies. I was actually freaked out because I hadn't expected that much of a mess. By the time I got home, I was laughing so hard I could barely breathe. His brother had been such a pain, so it felt like sweet revenge. 3 days later, during baseball practice, I saw my friend had a black eye, but was smiling when our eyes met. Apparently, his brother had lost it, stormed into the house, and punched him in the face. His mom freaked out, grounded him for the rest of the summer, and told my friend that he'd never do something like that. My friend played along and pretended he had no idea what happened. It turns out the smell of rotting fish never really left the car. From then on, we started calling his brother Lord of the Flies. Story 2. My girlfriend of 3 years, who I had been with since high school, broke up with me during my first semester of college. We were going to different schools, and I later found out she had started hooking up with one of her guy friends there. Anyway, during break, she asked me to return all the things she had given me over the years, gifts, sweatshirts, cards, and such. So I packed everything up and drove to her house to drop it all off. When I got there, I noticed she had invited all her friends over, and they were all sitting around with her and her parents in the garage. I walked up to the house with a bag full of all the stuff we'd exchanged over the years. Everyone there had these smug little smirks on their faces like they were all laughing at me. As I handed her back everything, I couldn't resist and said, "If only I could give back your virginity." The look on her parents' faces was priceless. I couldn't stop grinning. I turned and walked out of that situation with the biggest smile on my face, feeling like I just won. Story 3. My friend got roofied and SA'd by a frat guy about a decade ago at a local high-toned university. Despite a ton of evidence, he was never arrested, never expelled, never had to face any sort of penalty for this, and managed to get my friend labeled a slut who totally wanted it, and was now only pretending it was SA because he wouldn't break up with his girlfriend for her. Pretty charming guy, right? I put capsicum extract in his eye drops. Story 4. I went to school with this guy who was a real jerk. He bullied me a lot, and eventually I got fed up with it. One day, we were in the library, and I saw him log into a computer. As he went to check his emails, I happened to catch a glimpse of his password. To my surprise, it was just his name followed by a number. This was pretty basic and easy to guess. When I got home, I decided to take a quick look through his emails. I came across a conversation between him and a friend that really caught my attention. It turned out his mom had somehow convinced Centrelink, the Australian Unemployment Benefits Agency, that he had a learning disability so they could claim extra money. So I did what any frustrated person would do. I forwarded the email chain and his password to Centrelink. I'm sure they couldn't just access his email directly, but I suspect someone did some digging off the books. A few weeks later, I heard that my bully's family was getting taken to court for fraud and had to pay back the money they had claimed under false pretenses. I never found out how it ended because I graduated before the case was wrapped up, but I know they had to pay back thousands of dollars. Story 5. Everyone has probably worked with someone they didn't get along with. In my experience, there's always been that one person who just made the job a bit more difficult. You put up with it, but sometimes when the opportunity arises, you can get a little creative with how you handle it. Dave was one of those people. He was older, balding, and carried this patronizing attitude that made working with him a real challenge. He had worked at the company for years, and his view on contractors was less than favorable. He saw us as disposable, always undermining us with subtle digs, passive-aggressive remarks, and constant demands that didn't seem to make much sense. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was enough to make every workday a little harder. One day, my friend Robert, who shared an office space with Dave, reached out to me urgently. "We need to meet for coffee," he said, clearly excited about something. "Sure, what's going on?" I replied. He said, "No, you don't understand. We need to talk right away." I met him in the cafeteria, and he had this gleam in his eye. Once we were settled, he leaned in and told me something that completely caught me off guard. "Dave has a hobby," he said. "A hobby?" I raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? Dave is really into a very niche hobby. Let's just say he's into something unconventional. Apparently, Dave had been attending private-themed events that catered to adults with unusual interests. Robert had found out through some rather peculiar internet threads Dave had posted in, where he detailed his experiences at these events, discussing everything from techniques to personal stories. According to Robert, Dave had made a habit of sneaking away on weekends to attend these events, leaving his wife behind, all while keeping the entire thing a secret. The idea of Dave, who for all intents and purposes seemed like your average guy, being involved in something so out there was a complete shock to me. But what caught my attention was how he described everything in such detail. There were discussions about techniques, specific moves, and a whole subculture that I had no idea existed. Robert and I started looking into it more, and I decided to have a little fun of my own. I set up a fake profile online, using a persona I created named Sue. I started chatting with Dave, pretending to be an interested participant in his hobby. As time went on, Dave and I started exchanging messages, and he began sharing more details about his experiences, which let's just say were a bit over the top. It felt odd, but it was also kind of satisfying to know that this guy who had made my work life so difficult was essentially spilling his guts to someone he thought was a stranger. Every time Dave would pull his usual antics at work, I couldn't help but remember that I knew all these personal details about him. It was like I had a little power over him. Things took an interesting turn when Dave began asking for more personal information and started to share more about his private life. I played along, keeping it fun and harmless, sending Sue's photos, which were designed to look genuine, but weren't too revealing. Slowly, Dave began to open up more and more, and it was almost like he was completely under the illusion that he was developing some kind of real connection with Sue. Eventually, Robert and I decided to escalate things just a bit further, and I made a plan. We convinced Dave to meet Sue in person. He had been so invested in the online persona that he thought it was real. I told him I was coming to town and suggested we meet up. He was all for it. A few weeks later, Dave left for his trip, but when he returned, things weren't as he expected. I had crafted a message that turned everything upside down. I'd informed him that his private life had been exposed and that he'd been found out. I had set him up in such a way that he thought his secret was on the verge of being revealed to the people who mattered most to him, his family. Dave, clearly rattled by the situation, completely changed his demeanor. The confidence he'd once exuded was gone. He became much more withdrawn, keeping to himself, and much less confrontational at work. Robert and I had a laugh about it, but honestly, it was a strange feeling knowing that a simple act of turning the tables had caused such a shift in someone's behavior. The best part? Dave never bothered us again. He stopped making our lives harder, and we got a bit of peace for the remainder of our time at the company. In the end, it didn't feel like a major victory, but more like a lesson in how people can hide parts of themselves behind a facade. The moral of the story? Don't mess with people who have nothing left to lose, and don't underestimate the power of a little harmless mischief when you're backed into a corner. Story 6. We were hanging out at a sports bar, just drinking, playing pool, and shooting the breeze. My buddy, the one who had pulled that prank on me by seasoning my sausage with his pee. Yeah, he did it before they even put it on the grill, so it was like a piss marinade. Set his beer down and went to the restroom. One of the other guys pointed out that his beer was sitting unattended and suggested I should mess with it. Everyone knew about the sausage incident, and I hadn't really had a chance to get back at him yet. Well, I do the first thing that pops into my head, so I grabbed his beer, hit a corner, unzipped my pants, unleashed my meat, and put it in his beer. I proceeded to stir his beer a couple times with my D, resheath that bad boy, and place his beer back to where it was. When he came back, nobody said anything, and he enjoyed his newly stirred, not shaken beer. When he finished, I just asked, "Remember when you pissed on my sausage? How did my D taste, you jerk?" Story 7. A school bully used to knock my best friend's binder out of his hands every single day as we walked down the hall. This was back in high school, before things like Columbine, so people didn't really freak out when kids did messed up stuff like that. One day, I had an idea. I convinced my friend to stick a bunch of thumbtacks all along one side of his binder, turning it into a kind of makeshift spiked weapon. The plan was for him to just hold on tight and wait for the bully to do his thing. Sure enough, when the bully came over and slammed his hand down on it, he ended up getting a pretty bad cut. My friend held on and yanked the binder back, making sure he got a good dose of his own medicine. After that, the jerk didn't try anything like that again. Story 8. This wasn't me. It was my younger brother. When my brother was about 3, our dad had to look after him for the day. The plan was for him to take my brother to work with him after checking with his boss. It was office work, and my dad got along well with his boss, so my mom figured it wouldn't be a problem. However, my dad didn't want a toddler distracting him all day, so he decided to leave my brother in the car with the radio on and a carton of apple juice. We're in Britain, so it wouldn't get too hot, but either way, he was being a bit of a jerk about it. When the workday was over, my dad went back to the car, expecting to find my brother asleep, ready to drive home without saying a word to my mom. Instead, when he opened the door, he found my brother jumping up and down in the front seat, laughing, naked, slipping around, and completely covered in his own mess. He'd soiled himself, taken off his nappy, and the car was absolutely covered in it. There was poo smeared across the driver's seat, the windscreen, the steering wheel, the sat-nav, the windows, and even handprints on the ceiling. Our dad had no idea that a toddler could produce that much of a mess. The only part of the car that wasn't touched was his own seat. Story 9. I had this loud, obnoxious neighbor who was always causing trouble. One night, my wife had had enough. He and his drunk friends were wrestling and making a racket in the parking lot, so she called the cops. This guy was an angry, drunken guy from Mexico, and when the cops left, he decided to get back at us by breaking the antenna off my car. I stewed over that antenna for a week, but things got even worse when he came home at 6 a.m., stumbling up the stairs, waking me up again. A couple of hours later, we realized he'd left his keys in the door of his apartment. So, I quietly crept up the stairs, swiped his keys right out of the lock, and tossed them in a ditch a block away. The best part? Hearing him tear his place apart, moving furniture, and freaking out because he couldn't find them. And on top of that, his truck had 2 separate alarms, so after he lost his remotes, he had to replace both. I don't regret a thing. Story 10. One time when I worked in a small video store as an assistant manager, there was this one customer who was being a real a-hole to the point where I got fed up with his shit and threw him out. He had been an a-hole to every single other employee in the store, including our boss. He was just a mouthy, harassing jerk. Anyway, I saw him in a little strip mall nearby one time, and he was bragging to some guys about cheating on his workers' compensation. Then he pulls out this wad of cash and waves it under their noses like a Japanese fan. I got all this frigging free money from lying about my injured hand. What an a-hole. Anyway, if you go into the blue pages of the phone book, you'll find this listing in all cap letters that says, Workers' Compensation Fraud Hotline. And take a wild guess what video stores keep in their records? Full name, home address, and phone number. Not only did I turn this guy in, but was also able to provide great detail as to exactly how he was faking his injury as he explained it to his 2 friends. Story 11. I moved around a lot as a kid. My dad was in the army, and my parents got divorced. Constantly relocating meant that forming lasting friendships was nearly impossible. But on the flip side, it seemed like my situation attracted bullies like magnets. One day, I moved to a new school, and sure enough, a bully picked up on me right away. He'd trip me, shove me, and make fun of my clothes. Nothing too extreme, but I was already feeling unhappy, so it all hit me harder than it probably should have. One school day, I asked to use the restroom. On my way in, I passed that same bully. This time, though, he didn't do anything to me. When I walked into the bathroom, I was shocked to find someone had used the only stall, but not in the way you'd expect. They crapped on the floor. I turned around, grossed out, and was ready to report it. I was 7 at the time, so I figured I'd tell the teacher what I had seen. I started heading back to my classroom when, out of nowhere, a brilliant but mischievous idea popped into my head. Instead of going back to class, I walked straight to my bully's classroom and walked right in. Everyone turned to look at me. Normally, that would have been enough to make me back out and turn around. But not that day. I marched straight up to the teacher's desk, pointed at the bully, and said, "He's the one who pooped on the bathroom floor." The teacher's reaction was priceless way, better than I ever expected. She told him to follow her into the bathroom, and he started crying, shouting, "I didn't do it. He's lying," over and over. She handed him a paper towel and watched as he cleaned up his mess, putting it into the toilet. She then thanked me for telling her and sent me back to class. That happened about 20 years ago, but I still look back on that moment as a turning point in my life. It was like in that moment, I finally became me. Story 12. During the last year or so of my marriage, I had to travel a lot for work, commuting 3 to 4 days a week. One evening, while working remotely, I decided to do some upgrades on my home computers. I logged in remotely and noticed the connection was unusually slow. After running some network diagnostics, I discovered that my wife's computer was engaged in a video chat with someone from out of state, someone who didn't have any family there, at least not that I knew of. That raised my curiosity, so I started monitoring other things like unencrypted IM conversations. Over the next few weeks, I stayed quiet, gathering evidence. Most of it came from old-school chat services like Yahoo and AIM. I'd also installed security cameras around the house to keep an eye on the neighborhood kids, and eventually, I caught footage of a guy coming and going from our house, at one point even driving my car. But I kept my mouth shut. I knew if I confronted her, she'd just lie and twist things around to make me look like the bad guy. By this point, I knew who the guy was and I kept digging for more information. Then one day, he made a huge mistake. He plugged his laptop into my network. Now, I'm a network engineer and security admin by trade, so I know my way around networks, how to monitor them, and how to manipulate data if needed. Both my wife and her friend were well aware of this, but he still made the foolish decision to access my domain. I started grabbing usernames, passwords, email accounts, and IM account info. I rerouted all of their web traffic through a proxy to monitor where they were going and how they were logging in. Eventually, I hit the jackpot. It turns out the guy ran a fairly well-known gaming forum that generated a lot of revenue for him, and he logged into it without using SSL. He thought his login was secure because Bulletin hashes passwords before sending them in clear text. But if you know the hash, you can use it just like the actual password. I used his admin username and password hash to log in, then created a few admin accounts for myself. I made them look old by changing the account creation date. At this point, I could have just wiped his whole site, but that would have been too easy. Restoring from a backup would have fixed it. No, I had something better in mind. Every day, I went back and deleted random posts older than 6 months, then gradually deleted every post older than 6 months. I did this for 3 straight weeks before he started to catch on. When he finally noticed, he deleted one of my admin accounts. So, I quickly made my wife an admin and deleted all my other accounts. She called me in a panic shortly after. Her new guy was freaking out because it looked like she was the one who hacked the forums and deleted all the content. Thousands of posts were gone, and there was no way to restore them without wiping out 3 weeks' worth of newer posts. She was the only other person with admin access, aside from him, and he was furious. I played dumb, pretending I had no idea about the forum until she called me. There was no reason for me to know anything about it. They never made the connection between him using my home network and the forum getting wrecked. To this day, they don't know what happened. The incident caused him to end things with my wife, leaving her stranded when I eventually told her I was divorcing her a month later. By then, I had gathered enough evidence from their chat logs and forum posts to give me the closure I needed. She still has no idea how much I knew about her secret life. Edit: I should have mentioned earlier that during this time, the guy actually moved in from out of state. My wife helped him do this, probably with my money, which is how he ended up at our house, driving my car. I knew exactly when this was happening because of the details in their IM conversations. Story 13. I used to live in a tiny town, about 250 to 300 people. We didn't have any stores, gas stations, or much of anything really. One day, a local guy decided to open a small store that sold basic groceries and rented movies. He hired a few of us high school kids to work there, promising $50 a week for the summer to be paid at the end of the season. We agreed and spent the summer stocking shelves, cleaning the bathroom, doing lawn care, and handling whatever else needed doing. As the summer came to a close, it was our last day of work. The guy showed up with our paychecks, $1.50 each, for the whole summer. Naturally, we were pretty upset, but his response was basically, "What are you going to do about it? Drop the key off at my house since you won't need it anymore." So, we decided to get back at him. Before locking up the store for the last time, we left the window unlocked. We dropped the key off at his house like he told us to. Then, around midnight, we returned to the store. We grabbed as much as we could: cigarettes, money from the register, candy, whatever we could carry. We probably made off with about $1,000 worth of stuff. We locked the window back up, then slipped out through the emergency exit, which didn't have any alarms. And there were no cameras anywhere. The next day, the cops showed up. The guy accused all of us, but he had no proof. A few months later, he ended up shutting down the store because word got around the town about how he had stiffed us on our pay and people stopped supporting his business. I don't feel bad about it. The guy deserved it. Story 14. When my brother and I were kids, we spent a lot of time playing outside in our front yard. One day, we were playing baseball, and the ball rolled down the hill into our neighbor's backyard. So, my brother and I went inside for a few minutes to grab another ball. In that short time, our neighbor marched up the hill, knocked on our front door, and lost it. My mom answered, and he immediately started yelling at her about those darn kids ruining his lawn. She tried to calm him down, but he raised his fist like he was about to hit her. When my mom flinched, he just started laughing and spat on our doorstep. My brother and I saw the whole thing, and from that moment, we silently declared war. We played it smartly. We waited for the right moments, making sure not to raise any suspicion. To this day, we've never been caught because everything we did could have just been a coincidence. We didn't strike all at once. Instead, we spread things out over the course of several years. Here's a rough list of some of the things I remember doing. Pour deer scent into the AC intake vents of his car and house. filling the air with a truly unpleasant odor. Collected sharp objects like glass shards and nails, then scattered them at the ends of his driveway. Bought strong, concentrated weed killer, and applied it generously to his carefully tended shrubs and flowers. Found his car in public parking lots and threw bologna on it, hoping to damage the paint. No idea if it actually worked, but it felt satisfying. We would collect roadkill and other dead animals we came across. We had cats, and tossed them under the tarp covering his pool. Waited until they went on vacation and sprinkled sugar on their door frames and window sills, hoping to attract bugs into the house. I still don't feel guilty. The guy was a real troublemaker, and honestly, he still is. Story 15. When my dad lived in an apartment building with assigned parking, each tenant had a designated spot. But the problem was there was this one guy who kept parking in my dad's spot, despite him asking politely several times to stop. He even spoke to the landlords, but nothing changed. One day, after coming home to find the guy's car in his spot again, my dad decided he'd had enough. Now, my dad had been working on cars since he was 13, so he knew his way around a wrench. He had a jack in his trunk, so he used it to lift the guy's car off its rear tires. Since the car was rear-wheel drive, my dad had full control. Using the jack, he carefully maneuvered the car across the parking lot and hid it behind a dumpster. Once it was in place, he lowered the car, put the jack away, parked in a spot, and went upstairs to his apartment. Later that day, there was a knock on the door. It was a police officer, and the neighbor was standing behind him. The officer asked my dad if he knew what had happened to the neighbor's car, and my dad calmly replied, "He parked in my spot, and I've asked him not to multiple times, so I lifted his car and moved it behind the dumpster." Now, to give you some context, my dad is 6 feet 5 inches and was built like a brick house back in the day. Plus, he only has one eye, and the prosthetic one's a little smaller than his real one, giving him a bit of a madman look. When my dad pointed out the car through the window and explained exactly what he had done, the officer's eyes went wide. He turned to the neighbor and said, "Sir, I strongly suggest you never park in this man's spot again." After that, the guy never parked there again. Story 16. My high school girlfriend wasn't exactly kind. She had a way of isolating me from my friends and putting me down constantly. Eventually, I had enough. I ended things with her on picture day. She still went through with the photos, but her mascara was a mess. 2 days later, I reached out, apologized, and asked if we could get back together. She liked having control, so naturally she agreed. But then, on retake day, I ended things again. Perfect timing. Story 17. My first boyfriend in high school wasn't exactly a scholar, and one day he asked me to make him a fake report card so he could show it to his parents and avoid getting in trouble. To make things worse, he cheated on me with my best friend and then broke up with me. But in a twist, he promised we could get back together if I still made the fake report card for him. I agreed at first, but as the day came for us to get our real reports, I decided I wasn't going to do it. When he got home and saw his grades, it was all over. His dad absolutely laid into him for his string of D's and F's. Story 18. I waged bacteriological warfare against my parents using my science project. When I was around 7 or 8, I did a science project on how effective different soaps were at killing bacteria. The experiment involved keeping my hands dirty for a day, pressing my grimy thumbs into petri dishes with agar, then washing my hands and repeating the process. I compared the results, measuring how big or small the bacterial colonies were. Larger colonies meant the soap didn't work as well, and smaller ones meant it was more effective. It ended up winning the county science fair for my grade, which was a pretty cool win. But before the fair, after I'd finished the experiments, but before I'd thrown the petri dishes away, I had a disagreement with my parents. Can't remember what it was about. In a fit of rebelliousness, I decided to get back at them in a scientific way. I took the nastiest, most bacteria-laden culture from one of the dishes and swabbed it onto their bedroom doorknob. Needless to say, both of them ended up getting really sick. I had to take care of them for a couple of days, which was a real lesson in karma. But I told them long ago, and we laugh about it now. Story 19. I'm about to make a major change in a few days. The situation with my parents has become unbearable. I've been juggling school, taking care of them, and trying to keep things afloat, but it's clear they've been taking advantage of me for far too long. They've been dishonest, trying to pawn my things, and it feels like I'm constantly doing all the work without any appreciation or respect in return. I'm currently out of town, but when I get back, I've made up my mind. The next time they ask me to walk 2 miles to get them a pack of cigarettes, I'm not going to just give in. Instead, I'll walk outside, take a lap around the house, and have a friend bring a van over. I'll pack up my things, grab what I need, and leave. I'll stay with my friend for a few days until my train ticket to start a new life across the country. A friend just helped me secure a job, and I'll be starting fresh in a new city, 2,000 miles away. They'll be left to continue down their destructive path while I finally take control of my own life. It's time for me to stop being the one to clean up their mess and start living for myself. Story 20. One day, my neighbor accidentally knocked over my dad's motorcycle and just left it lying on the ground. The mirror was shattered, and they didn't even bother leaving their insurance information. My dad didn't want to get the police involved, claiming they probably hadn't noticed, but I saw them clearly look at the bike and just carry on like nothing had happened. It really bothered me, so I decided to have a little fun in retaliation. I ended up ordering 20 taxis, 5 Chinese takeaways, and even arranged for a stripper dressed as a police officer to show up at their place, all at 1 a.m. in the morning. It was a really a-hole thing to do, but we all do stupid things, right? Story 21. My best friend since I was 3 started texting and flirting with, then eventually sleeping with, my boyfriend of 7 years. Of course, they were both apologetic, regretful, and begged for me to take them back. They both swore it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But guess what? It happened again. At that point, my best friend had this obsessive relationship with a guy named Billy, who was devastated by her infidelity. Billy felt like his whole world was falling apart. He'd lost both his girlfriend and his job. So, I hired him in my workplace where I was a manager just to give him a bit of a lifeline. We became good friends, but my now ex-best friend was losing it. Then I decided to have a little fun. I started a rumor that Billy and I were seeing each other seriously. She caught wind of it when she saw us together in my car, and of course, she went ballistic. She started texting me, going off with things like, "How could you do this to me?" and "Why would you betray me like this?" I just ignored her. After dropping Billy off at home, I dipped off the road, but things took a turn. I ended up having to fire Billy for stealing from the company. In the end, I got my revenge. I messed with both of their heads. I made them feel what I felt without stooping to their level of cheating. They both think I did something I didn't, and honestly, I'm fine with that. Story 22. When I was about 13 or 14, I used to hang out with my 21-year-old neighbors. At the time, I didn't realize that all they ever did was talk me into doing stupid stuff and then bail when things went south. This pattern continued until I was around 17, when it finally clicked what was really happening. I was furious and wanted revenge, but by the time I had a plan in mind, they'd already moved away. That didn't stop me, though. These guys were hardcore stoners and always had parties, so I decided to make my move anyway. One night, I showed up to one of their parties and hung out in the back. In my car, I had 5 cartons of heavy whipping cream that I'd bought 6 months earlier and had kept in the fridge until the right moment. I carefully poured 1 carton into each of the air vents inside the house. I still had 1 carton left, so I poured the one into the AC unit too, though I'm not sure if it actually did anything. The smell was absolutely rancid, so bad that I had to stop myself from throwing up a few times. A couple of weeks later, I heard the house was up for sale, but no one was willing to buy it because of the stench. From what I heard, they eventually gave up on selling it and tried burning the house down. After an investigation, the oldest brother was arrested for fraud and ended up serving a year in prison. I haven't heard anything about them since. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.